Today's headlines. The government of Tigray has announced that it will be releasing 4,200 prisoners of war, including 400 women. Twelve human rights organizations based in the continent have written an open letter to the United Nations Security Council saying that history was once again repeating itself in Tigray as the Council fails to take decisive action to prevent genocide. Hello and welcome to those of you watching Tigrai TV on satellite television, as well as on our social media platforms, Facebook and YouTube. I'm Saplor Glama and I'm here with Thursday's news for the hour. The government of Tigray has announced that it will be releasing 4,200 prisoners of war, including 400 women. In its press statement earlier today, the coordinator for the Center of the Prisoners of War, Unauthorized, said that the prisoners would be transported to areas bordering the region and released on Friday, May 20, 2022. Berhanu emphasized that essentials like food and medical supplies for the POWs came from residents of Magala who, despite facing difficult hardship themselves, had chosen to share what little they had. Salome Tigrai has the details.
The government of Tigray announced earlier today that it would be releasing more than 4,000 prisoners of war on Friday. Coordinator for the center, Unauthorized, said that the prisoners of war were being released despite the clear threats by the Ethiopian government to reignite war with Tigray.
መንግስት ትግራይ ሒዝዎም ዝነበረ ናይ ምርኳት ምሕረት እዩ ይለቅቀሎ ለማዓልቲ ዝልቀቁ ዘለው 4208 እዮም
The government of Tigray is releasing 4,208 prisoners of war, of which 400 are women. This decision comes despite the looming threat of war. Religious leaders, politicians, and all concerned bodies should plead with Ethiopian authorities, who are actively working to dismantle the country, to refrain from causing further bloodshed.
The coordinator emphasized that food and other essentials for prisoners of war were provided by residents of Magala that contributed from what little they had during this difficult period.
ህዝቢ ትግራይ ኣብዚ ሕዚ እዋን ያው ከምቲ ኩሉ ዝፈልጦ ተዓጽዩ ዝኒሄ እንታይ መስዒ እንታይ ከም ዝድረሩ ዝፈልጦ ነገር የብሉን
The people have nothing to eat because of the siege, but have been sharing what little food, medication and water is available to them over the past 11 months. This is to support the war prisoners that have been committing unspeakable atrocities.
Berhanu said that the prisoners of war would be escorted to the borders on the region on Friday morning and would hopefully be rejoining their families soon.
ብሰላም አበቶም ንክበፅሑ ክሳብቲ መንግስቲ ትግራይ ዘመሓዳድር ከባቢ በአግባቡን በስርዓትን
The government will be escorting them to the border areas under its administration. We wish them all the very best.
11 ወር እዚህ ግቢ ላይ በምርኮ ማዕከል ላይ ስንቆይ
In our 11 months stay here, the people of Tigray have shared what they have with us. Even when they weren't receiving aid, they didn't fail to support. They had been forgotten by the world. We are grateful for this.
የትግራይ ህዝብ ሳይኖረው ከለት ጉርሱ እየቀነሰ ሲያበላል ሲያጠጣል ለሰባት ለስምንት ወር
The people of Tigray had been feeding us for 7-8 months when they had nothing for themselves. They have been giving us food and clothes. We are so grateful.
እውነት ለመናገር ከሆነ ጦርነት ለማንም አስፈላጊ አይደለም.
War does no good for anyone. War brings hunger and causes destruction. We should say no to war.
The government of Tigray has over 10,000 prisoners of war in its custody, who, like a million of people in Tigray, have been denied recognition and humanitarian assistance by the Ethiopian government.
12 human rights organizations based in the continent have written an open letter to the United Nations Security Council saying that history was once again repeating itself in Tigray as the council fails to take decisive action to prevent genocide. The organization said that the Ethiopian government was attempting to use food as a weapon of war in Tigray and is actively blocking vital services to the region. The civil society organizations called on the council to impose an arms embargo on Ethiopian and Eritrean governments and to take decisive action to ensure that those responsible for gross human rights violations in Tigray are held accountable. Fanuel Emmeru has more.
12 civil society organizations, including Uganda's Atrocity Watch Africa, Nigeria's Center for Democracy and Development, and the Institute for Human Rights and Development in Africa, wrote an open letter to the United Nations Security Council on Wednesday calling for urgent action to end the genocide in Tigray. The civil society organizations said that history was once again repeating itself as the United Nations fails to learn from its previous failures in Africa by failing to take a decisive action to end the genocidal war on Tigray. The civil society organization said that history was once again repeating itself as the United Nations failed to learn from its previous failures in Africa by failing to take a decisive action to end the genocidal war on Tigray. The organization said that the Ethiopian government was using food as a weapon of war, blocking much-needed humanitarian assistance and vital services into the region. The organizations called on the Security Council to impose an arms embargo on the Ethiopian and Eritrean governments and take further action to ensure that all those responsible for gross violations of human rights in Tigray are held accountable.
In its most recent statement, Tigray External Affairs Office has called claims of forced mobilizations to Tigray's armed forces outrageous. The office reminded that it had in fact been the massive scale and nature of the violence committed on Tigrayan civilians that has served as a motivating factor for thousands of young women and men to join the resistance. The statement asked the international media continue to pressure the Ethiopian government to provide access into Tigray and refrain from pushing stories with questionable sources. Saron Tsagai reports.
In its latest statement, Tigray External Affairs Office called the recent allegation of forced mobilization into Tigray's armed forces outrageous and said that the people of Tigray have the right to voluntarily mobilize forces for the purpose of self-defense against the genocidal war that has been waged on them. The statement said that the scale of violence committed against civilians by Ethiopian and Eritrean forces had forced thousands of youths to join the resistance to fend off genocide. The statement said that Tigray's armed forces were a group of determined, conscious and well-trained youngsters who know what and why they're fighting for, and said that it had been a long-held belief of its government that forced conscription cannot bring about sustainable victory. In its statement, the office highlighted that the government was working to address incidents of administrative irregularities at the lower rank of government, including verification and screening mechanisms, but emphasized that minor and sporadic irregularities do not in any way define the character and valor of Tigray's forces. The statement also stated that any attempt to depict the Tigray's armed forces in such a way, sometimes by citing testimonies of alleged prisoners of war, are but malign campaign to paint false image of Tigray's armed forces. The statement reaffirmed its commitment to facilitate unfettered access to independent stakeholders, including humanitarian organizations, human rights groups, journalists, and researchers interested to investigate the issue on the ground. The office called on the international media organizations to continue to pressure the Ethiopian government for access into Tigray and ensure the stories on the ground are comprehensively covered.
Violence against civilian Tigrayans has started long before November 4 of 2020, when Ethiopia formally declared war on Tigray. We spoke with one former resident of the Amhara region who was displaced from his home of almost 3 decades by an unidentified armed group in the region. He tells us about the gruesome attacks that forced him to leave his home and seek shelter in an IDP camp in Magala, where he's still residing almost 3 years later. Saron Tsagai.
Mariam Nagasi was a farmer in Armachoho in the Amhara region in 2016. He had been a resident of Amhara for more than 2 decades and says him and his family had built a happy and successful life in the region. But in August of 2016, all this would change. He says armed men told Tigrayans that they had to leave the area, a warning he says him and his family had not received. Days later, these armed men came to his house, looted and destroyed his property, physically assaulted him and left him for dead.
It was in August 18 of 2016. I was on my farm when a group of young men, armed with machetes, sticks with nails sticking out of them, and stones, came. Their leaders had Kalashnikovs. I think every Tigrayan was told to leave, but I hadn't heard because my farm is a little outside the city. They beat me till I blacked out. They thought I was dead and left me there.
Walla Gabriel says his neighbors found him unconscious, put him on a cart and brought him to Tigray, where he was able to receive medical treatment.
A local resident and his wife found me unconscious on the ground, picked me up and took me to Abdelrafi using a cart, and then finally took me to Humara for medical treatment.
Months later, Walda Gabriel says he decided to return to Gondar after promises by regional authority and the federal government that the situation in Armachoho had improved. But upon arrival, he says he was arrested by Amhara authority and further abused.
When I went back, I found that my house and all my wealth had been burned to the ground. Moreover, the official in Abrahajira 01 Kabele accused me of faking my death. They released my attackers in Soroka and detained me instead. My health started to deteriorate in the prison. My body was swollen. My cellmates complained to the guard and said they couldn't stand to be in a cell with me because of my condition. So the guard took me out and dumped me in the streets.
He says officials in the region did nothing to help thousands of Tigrayans displaced from Gondar in 2016, and in effect encouraged the violence on Tigrayans to continue. At the time, Walda Gabriel had traveled to the capital of the administrative zone in Gondar, only to be told that nothing could be done.
The Warada administrator called and asked the local authorities about my property, my remaining property, as well as those already destroyed. They told them I can sue in the civil court for properties destroyed, but said they couldn't do anything for me in regard to the properties that I had left behind.
Says he stayed in the region hoping that justice would be served until he lost hope and returned to Tigray months later. Walda Gabriel believes that the violence on Tigrayans today is a continuation of the violence him and thousands of Tigrayans witnessed in Gondar in August of 2016.
What we are seeing now, the massacre, burning people alive, and destruction of properties started in 2016.
Walda Gabriel has been sheltered in an IDP camp in Maqala for more than 3 years now. For months, him and hundreds of thousands more like him have not been able to access basics, such as food and medication.
We are struggling to survive every day. 3 people have died here due to hunger. A 4th one is in the hospital.
There are more than 2 million IDPs in Tigray, all unable to access basics such as food and medication due to Ethiopian government's blockade on humanitarian assistance.
The blockade on commercial goods and vital services, such as banking, has put many in Tigray in a desperate situation. Waini Wildebrhan owned a small cafe here in Maqala and used the income to support her family. But since the start of the conflict, that has blocked all commercial goods from coming into the region, had forced her to close her business. Unable to pay rent for her home, she's now seeking shelter in an incomplete building in the city, causing illness to her 2-year-old child. Aragawi Gabra Mikhail.
Waini Wildebrhan is a single mother residing in the city of Mekelle. She used to own a small cafe to support herself, but she has had to close shop ever since the start of the conflict because she was no longer able to make profit.
I was known for my breakfast until recently, but then everything became so expensive. Cooking oil, pepper, bread, sugar, everything. It's almost impossible to sustain a business in these conditions.
For months, the Ethiopian government has blocked all forms of transport in and out of Tigray, as well as blocking all forms of commercial goods. But even if items were available in markets, the blockade on banking services in the region has meant that very few in the region can afford what very little is available in the market. Waini is just one of the millions struggling to make ends meet because of the blockade on Tigray. Waini and her son are now homeless, living in an unfinished building in Sawakare, in the outskirts of Mekelle.
It's so very cold here. The wind at night blows through the holes here. I try to cover the holes with pieces of clothing, but it doesn't make much difference. There's no electricity. It can get so scary at night.
Waini says her son's health has deteriorated due to their living conditions, but she hasn't been able to get him the necessary treatment due to the blockade.
My son is constantly catching a cold because this house is so cold. Whenever I take him to the health center, they tell me nothing is available. Sometimes I beg and buy him medication from private pharmacies. His eyes also get infected a lot. This house is so dusty.
When he says that, the most heartbreaking part is that she had such high hopes for the future and never thought she would find herself in this position.
I used to save 20 birr every day. I was also hoping to make my cafe a little bigger. I never imagined that I'd end up here. I'm now living on the charity of others.
The blockade on essential goods into Tigray has left many in desperate need, with over 6.5 million people in Tigray in dire need of humanitarian assistance. A humanitarian crisis is looming in Tigray as the world stands idly by.
The blockade on food aid and medical supplies in Tigray has above all devastated pregnant women and children who have not been able to access medical care. Hiwat is just one of thousands unable to reach health facility due to lack of transport, and says that when she was finally able to reach a facility, 7 months into her pregnancy, she was told she has lost her child. Winta Kidana has more for us.
The blockade on food aid and medical supplies in Tigray has above all devastated pregnant women and children who have not been able to access medical care. Hiwat says she wasn't able to reach a hospital for prenatal care for months due to lack of transport, and says that when she finally arrived to the hospital, she was told that she had lost her baby.
I couldn't reach a hospital for 7 months at the start of my pregnancy because taxis were so inaccessible. I came here when I reached 7 months. They told me I had lost my child, and they said to wait so they could clean my uterus.
But Hiwat says doctors were not able to perform surgery for some time because they didn't have the necessary medications available to them.
There was no food or medication here, so they couldn't perform the surgery. We even tried to purchase the medication from private pharmacies, but we couldn't find it there either. It was only after some time that they could do the surgery.
Hiwat says that because she had been receiving sufficient medical attention during her previous pregnancies, she had given birth to 4 healthy children, including triplets, born during her first pregnancy.
I had triplets and then a girl. The service at the hospital was very good. There was enough medication, food, and clothing for mothers. But now there is nothing. The doctors are nice, but there is no food or medication.
Hiwat calls on the international community to play its part to ensure that Tigrayans are able to access medication as well as food aid.
The world has to do something, or I don't see how the people could continue to live like this. How can they live with no medication or money? The world must help us.
And that wraps up today's news. Thank you for tuning in.